November 16th, 2012. Lawyers in the lobby. 18,500 workers clocking in for the last time. They didn't know. Nobody told them. That Friday morning, across 33 bakeries from Kansas to Maine, the people who made 500 million Twinkies a year showed up like always. And by 3 p.m., every single one of them was out of a job. Forever. Not restructuring, liquidation, the end, $2.5 billion in revenue. Gone in one workday. And here's what nobody talks about. While workers lost their pensions, executives gave themselves 80% raises. This is the real story of how America's most iconic snack cake was destroyed. Not by changing tastes, not by health trends, but by greed, betrayal, and a war inside the company that nobody could stop. To understand what Hostess was, you have to understand what America was in 1919. The First World War had just ended. The country was urbanizing at a pace that had no historical precedent. Families that had baked their own bread for generations were moving into cities, into apartments without proper kitchens, into factory jobs where the workday started before dawn and ended after dark. The concept of commercially baked bread you didn't make yourself, was still new enough that it required a degree of cultural persuasion. People had to be convinced that factory bread was not inferior bread. It was into this particular moment that the Continental Baking Company was born, assembled through a series of mergers and acquisitions of regional bakeries that would eventually give it national reach. Continental was not built around a single founder with a visionary obsession. It was built around a business insight that Americans were about to need a lot of bread, and that whoever could deliver it cheapest and most consistently at industrial scale across the widest possible geography would own that market. Wonder Bread came in 1921. The brand name had been inspired, according to company legend, by the sense of wonder that an executive felt watching a hot air balloon festival. The product itself was a genuine innovation for its time. Soft, uniform, consistent, with a shelf life that homemade bread couldn't match. And when, in 1930, Continental began enriching Wonder Bread with vitamins and minerals, it became something more than a convenience product. It became, in the language of mid-century American public health messaging, a nutritional pillar. The Twinkie arrived the same year, 1930, in the middle of the Great Depression, when the country needed the opposite of luxury. James Dewar, a manager at Continental's Chicago area Hostess Bakery in River Forest, Illinois, noticed that the company's shortcake pans sat idle most of the year. They were only used during strawberry season. He had the idea of filling small sponge cake shells with a cream filling and selling them inexpensively. The name supposedly came from a billboard advertising twinkle toe shoes that Dewar spotted on the drive to his boss's office. The original Twinkie sold for a nickel. 2 for a nickel, to be precise. At its 1930 introduction, the cream filling was made with real bananas, which is why the flavor profile of the modern Twinkie seems oddly nostalgic to people who grew up eating them in the 1960s and 1970s. During World War II, banana imports were restricted, and the filling was reformulated with vanilla. After the war, it simply stayed that way. Americans had grown up eating the vanilla version, so the vanilla version became canonical. What's worth understanding about this origin story is the specific genius of Dewar's idea. He solved a problem of industrial inefficiency. The shortcake pans were sitting there. The oven capacity existed. The distribution network existed. The only question was what to put in the pans and at what price point. The Twinkie was not primarily a culinary achievement. It was an optimization of industrial baking capacity, which, in a peculiar way, perfectly encapsulates why the company's eventual failure would be so unnecessary. By the mid-20th century, continental baking was enormous, Wonder Bread was sold in every major American market. Hostess cakes, the Twinkie, the Ding Dong, introduced 1967, the Ho-Ho, 1967, the Snowball, 1947, had achieved the particular status that only a few consumer products ever reach. They had become cultural objects, not just food, symbols, characters in cartoons, punchlines, references. This cultural saturation was worth something specific to the company. It meant that Hostess could spend very little on explaining what its products were. Everyone already knew. The marketing budget could focus on reinforcing familiarity rather than building awareness. For decades, this was a genuine competitive advantage. The workforce that built this empire was organized, skilled, and because the company had operated through the New Deal, through wartime labor agreements, through the post-war consolidation of American union power, covered by contracts that had been negotiated when the company was generating serious money and when the economic assumptions underpinning those contracts seemed reasonable and permanent. Those contracts would become, decades later, one half of the story of how the company destroyed itself. Continental Baking Company became part of Ralston Purina in 1968. This matters. Ralston Purina is best known today for pet food. It was not a natural steward of an iconic American baking company. The acquisition was part of the conglomerate era of American business, when diversification across unrelated industries was considered a sophisticated management strategy. The logic, such as it was, held that skilled management was transferable across any business, and that spreading risk across diverse revenue streams protected against sector-specific downturns. The practical effect, in Continental's case, was that the company became a division of a corporation whose core competencies lay elsewhere, managed by executives whose primary loyalties and career incentives were structured around the parent company's priorities, not around the baking business specifically. Ralston Purina eventually divested Continental Baking in 1995, selling it to a company called Interstate Bakeries Corporation for approximately $330 million. Interstate Bakeries was, at that point, the second largest baker in the United States. The combined company, keeping the Continental/Hostess brands, became the largest wholesale baker in the country. It seemed, on paper, like an industrial combination that made sense. What it actually created was a company that was suddenly responsible for an enormous number of brands, an enormous number of distribution routes, and an enormous number of labor contracts, all of which needed to be rationalized, consolidated, and modernized. That rationalization never really happened. The cost structures that came along with the Continental brands were absorbed into Interstate's operations, and the fundamental questions about how to run the business efficiently in a changing market were deferred. The distribution system alone was a monument to a different era of American commerce. Hostess used what's called a direct store delivery model, in which company-employed drivers drove company-owned trucks directly to retail stores, unloaded the product, stocked the shelves themselves, and took back any unsold product. This was the standard model when it was built, and it provided control over product presentation and freshness. But it was also expensive, particularly when union contracts specified that Wonder Bread drivers could not handle Hostess cake products on the same truck. That cake drivers could not handle bread. That drivers from different product lines could not substitute for one another during sick days or vacations. This sounds almost comically inefficient because it was. A Hostess distribution center might have multiple trucks pulling up to the same grocery store in a single morning, each operated by a driver from a different bargaining unit, each carrying a different product line. The cost of this system, in drivers, in trucks, in fuel, in time, was built into the price structure of every product the company sold. By 2000, Interstate Bakeries was in serious trouble. The company was carrying substantial debt from the Continental acquisition. The American white bread market was in structural decline. The number of Americans buying white bread as a household staple had been falling for years. Under pressure from changing dietary preferences, the rise of specialty breads, and the ongoing collapse of the traditional weekday family lunch, Wonder Bread's market share was eroding. In January 2004, Interstate Bakeries filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the first time. This first bankruptcy was not a death sentence. Chapter 11 is reorganization, not liquidation. The company continued operating, but the reorganization process moved slowly, bogged down in the complexity of 12 different union contracts, disagreements between creditors, and the fundamental question of whether the business model was viable in its current form. It took 4 years. Interstate Bakeries emerged from bankruptcy in 2009, having shed some debt but having not fundamentally restructured either its cost base or its strategic position. And, within months, the company's ownership would change in a way that would accelerate rather than resolve its problems. When Interstate Bakeries emerged from bankruptcy in 2009, the reorganized company was acquired by a consortium of private equity firms, with Ripplewood Holdings as the lead investor. The company was renamed Hostess Brands. Private equity acquisitions of distressed companies follow a general pattern. The acquiring firms take on some debt to finance the purchase. They install new management. They look for costs to cut, businesses to sell, and operational efficiencies to capture. They plan to either take the company public or sell it to a strategic buyer within a defined investment horizon, typically 3 to 7 years. The model requires the underlying business to generate enough cash flow to service the debt from the acquisition, while also funding the operational improvements that make the eventual sale attractive. The Hostess acquisition, in retrospect, was a case study in what happens when this model is applied to a business that cannot actually generate sufficient cash flow. Ripplewood and its partners paid approximately $130 million in equity for Hostess, but the company they acquired came loaded with pre-existing pension obligations and was immediately loaded with additional debt to fund the acquisition itself. By the time Hostess was operating as a standalone company under new management in 2009, it was carrying total liabilities that would prove impossible to manage. The pension problem deserves specific attention because it is one of the most important elements of the story and the one most frequently mischaracterized in popular accounts. Hostess was obligated to contribute to a series of multi-employer pension plans, industry-wide pension funds covering not just Hostess workers, but workers across the baking industry. These plans had been negotiated over decades, when the baking industry was larger, more profitable, and populated by more contributing employers. As the industry had contracted over the years, as smaller bakeries closed, as competitors went under, as the workforce shrank, the number of employers contributing to these plans had fallen. But the number of retirees drawing from them had not fallen. The result was that the surviving employers, including Hostess, were increasingly responsible for funding benefits for workers who had never worked for them. This is the structural tragedy of multi-employer pension plans in declining industries. The obligations are real. The workers who earned those benefits earned them legitimately. But the economic context in which those commitments were made had ceased to exist. By 2011, Hostess owed more than $2 billion in unfunded pension obligations to these plans. That number was not going away. New management at Hostess, the company cycled through 3 CEOs in roughly 3 years, attempted to address the cost structure, but found itself constrained at every turn. The union contracts were specific and detailed. Work rules were embedded in agreements that required expensive renegotiation. The distribution system remained inefficient, and management, in a decision that would later become a significant point of controversy, continued to pay top executives substantial compensation, even as the company argued to its unions that labor costs needed to be dramatically reduced. The precise numbers matter. In 2011, Hostess's CEO, Brian Driscoll, received total compensation of approximately $2.55 million. 9 other Hostess executives received pay increases ranging from 35% to 80%, at a time when the company was in or near bankruptcy and was arguing that hourly workers needed to accept significant wage and benefit cuts to keep the company alive. Think about what that information meant to a worker who had been at a Hostess bakery for 20 years. You are being asked to take a pay cut, to accept reduced pension contributions, to work under tightened work rules, and simultaneously, the people making that request are giving themselves raises of 80%. The relationship between Hostess management and its unions, particularly the Bakery, Confectionery, Tobacco Workers, and Grain Millers International Union, BCTGM, deteriorated into something that functioned less like a labor negotiation and more like a Cold War. Both sides had legitimate grievances. Neither side could afford to completely give in. And the company did not have the time or the financial flexibility to wait for trust to be rebuilt. Hostess workers were represented by 2 primary unions: the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, which covered most of the company's drivers and distribution workers, and the Bakery, Confectionery, Tobacco Workers, and Grain Millers International Union, BCTGM, which covered most of the bakers themselves. These 2 unions had very different histories with Hostess and very different strategic calculations in the final crisis. The Teamsters represented approximately 7,500 Hostess workers. The BCTGM represented approximately 5,000. The remaining workers were covered by smaller unions under various of the 372 collective bargaining agreements. In the summer and fall of 2012, as Hostess moved toward its second bankruptcy filing, the company presented both unions with a proposed new labor agreement. The terms were severe: an 8% immediate wage cut, followed by increases over subsequent years that would partially offset but not fully reverse that cut, significant reductions in healthcare and pension contributions, and modifications to work rules that would allow, among other things, drivers from different product lines to be consolidated onto single trucks. The Teamsters, after contentious internal debate and after a review of the company's financial situation by an independent financial advisor hired by the union, reluctantly concluded that the company's financial position was genuine, that absent the concessions, the company would liquidate. The Teamsters leadership recommended that members ratify the contract. In November 2012, Teamsters members voted to accept the new contract. The BCTGM's membership voted to reject it. The BCTGM's position was not irrational. The union had been through this before. The first bankruptcy had also involved demands for concessions, and after those concessions were made, the executives took raises. The union had reason to believe, based on pattern, that accepting cuts now would not save the company. That management would extract the concessions and then mismanage the company into failure anyway, and that workers would end up with reduced wages and a dead company rather than their previous wages and a dead company. The BCTGM also argued, with some justification, that the company's own management decisions, the executive compensation, the failure to modernize the product line, the slow response to changing consumer preferences had contributed at least as much to the company's distress as labor costs had. Why should workers bear the entire cost of failures they did not cause? On November 9, 2012, 1 week before the final liquidation announcement, BCTGM workers at 8 Hostess facilities went on strike. This was the last card the union had, and it was, almost certainly, a fatal miscalculation. Not because the union was wrong about the injustice of its situation, but because the company's financial position was so precarious that there was simply no space for the confrontation to resolve itself in any productive direction. Hostess management gave the striking workers a deadline: return to work by November 15th, or the company would seek liquidation. The deadline passed. On November 16th, Judge Robert Drain of the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York approved Hostess's motion to wind down operations. 18,500 workers lost their jobs. Not just the BCTGM members who had gone on strike, all of them. Picture the Hostess Bakery in Emporia, Kansas, on the morning of November 16, 2012. Emporia is a city of about 24,000 people in the Flint Hills region of central Kansas. It has a college, a lake, and a Hostess bakery that had been operating since the 1950s. The plant employed approximately 600 workers, an enormous number for a city that size. These were not marginal jobs, they were union jobs, with wages that could support a mortgage and health insurance and, in theory, a pension. Workers arrived that morning not knowing with certainty what was coming. The rumors had been circulating for days: the strike, the deadline, the bankruptcy court. But Hostess had been in and out of bankruptcy before. The company had survived its first Chapter 11. Plants had stayed open. Product had kept moving. By mid-morning, the announcement came. Hostess was liquidating. All operations were ceasing. Everyone was to complete their current shift and go home. The bakery in Emporia would not be opening tomorrow. This scene repeated itself simultaneously in 33 bakeries across the country. In Biddeford, Maine. In Columbus, Ohio. In Indianapolis, Indiana. In Denver, Colorado. In Los Angeles, California. In every one of these cities and towns, on the same Friday morning, the same announcement was made. The machines that had been running for decades were shut down. The ovens went cold, the conveyor belts stopped. The panic that followed was immediate and specific. Workers began calling union reps, trying to understand what severance they were owed, whether their health insurance would continue, what would happen to their pension contributions from the preceding months. The answers were not reassuring. Hostess had been contributing to its pension obligations inconsistently for some time. Workers who had counted on pension checks in retirement suddenly weren't sure those checks would arrive. The 565 distribution routes stopped that day. Trucks that had been making daily deliveries to grocery stores across the country simply did not show up. Within 24 hours, grocery store shelves that had held Twinkies and Wonder Bread and Ding Dongs began to empty out. The consumer reaction was extraordinary and, depending on your perspective, either deeply human or deeply strange. People began hoarding Twinkies. Within hours of the liquidation announcement, convenience stores and grocery stores were reporting that their existing Hostess inventory was selling out. On eBay, individual boxes of Twinkies were listed for prices ranging from $20 to, in one documented case, $150. A box that had retailed for $3.99 that morning was suddenly, briefly, a collector's item. This panic buying revealed something important about the nature of what Hostess actually was. People were not panicking because they were worried about where to find a satisfying snack cake. They were panicking because a cultural artifact was disappearing. The Twinkie was not primarily a food product. It was a symbol of American mid-century industrial abundance, of school lunches and convenience stores, and the particular aesthetic of packaged snack foods that had defined the American supermarket for 60 years. It had survived nuclear attack jokes, jokes about its shelf life outlasting civilization itself, and 4 decades of nutritional skepticism. And now it was suddenly, actually gone. Before the bankruptcy, Hostess had never fully understood, or perhaps never properly monetized, what its brand portfolio actually represented. The Twinkie's cultural shelf life was genuinely extraordinary. It had appeared in the 1984 film Ghostbusters as a metaphor for the scale of supernatural energy the protagonists were dealing with. It had been referenced in presidential campaigns, in discussions of American dietary decadence, in jokes about the 1978 Twinkie defense in the Dan White murder trial in San Francisco. By the 1990s, the cultural myth of the Twinkie's shelf life, that it would survive indefinitely, that it could outlast the apocalypse, had become so pervasive that it appeared in textbooks and science curricula as a genuine question to be investigated. The actual shelf life of a Twinkie, for the record, is approximately 45 days, not decades. The myth was considerably more durable than the product. The point is that Hostess was sitting on brand equity that was worth something specific and real. But the company had consistently underinvested in its brands relative to competitors. Hostess spent a fraction of what companies like Little Debbie's parent company McKee Foods spent on advertising and marketing, while simultaneously charging prices in the same range. It failed to update its product line in any serious way to respond to changing consumer preferences. There were no premium ingredient versions, no health-adjacent reformulations, no product extensions that might capture consumers who were interested in the brand but deterred by the nutritional profile. Little Debbie, by stark contrast, ran a lean, family-owned operation in Collegedale, Tennessee, with lower overhead, no shareholders demanding returns, and work rules that were considerably more flexible. McKee Foods made similar products, sold them at lower prices, and made money. Hostess made similar products, sold them at similar prices, and went bankrupt twice. The brands were not the problem. The brands were, in fact, the only thing that survived. When Hostess announced liquidation in November 2012, the intellectual property, the brand names, the recipes, the trade dress retained substantial value. Private equity firms immediately recognized that the brands could be profitably relaunched under radically different operational circumstances, without the union contracts, without the defined benefit pension obligations, without the legacy distribution infrastructure. The auction of Hostess brand assets, which took place in early 2013, generated significant competitive bidding. The Twinkie and Hostess cake brands, Ding Dongs, Ho-Hos, Donettes, and the others, were sold for $410 million to a joint venture between two private equity firms, Apollo Global Management and Metropolis & Co. Wonder Bread and the bread brands were sold separately to Flower Foods for $360 million. The total proceeds from the brand sales exceeded $860 million, more than 3 times what Ripplewood and its partners had paid to acquire the entire company in 2009. This is worth sitting with. The brands that Hostess had failed to adequately monetize, the intellectual property of products the company had mismanaged for years, were worth nearly $1 billion to buyers who would run the operation without the cost structure that had killed the original company. The Twinkie returned to store shelves in July 2013, 7 months after the liquidation. The new Hostess, a company with a fraction of the original's workforce, no union contracts, and a much simpler distribution model that used third-party distributors rather than a company-owned fleet, sold Twinkies and made money. The 18,500 workers who had lost their jobs in November 2012 were not invited to participate in this revival. The human story of the Hostess collapse did not end on November 16, 2012. For thousands of workers, it continued for years afterward, in a series of legal proceedings, pension fund communications, and ultimately devastating financial outcomes that received almost no attention in the popular coverage of the Twinkie apocalypse. The pension situation was complex and genuinely tragic. Workers in the BCTGM's pension plans faced a specific problem. Their pensions were insured by the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, PBGC, the federal agency that backstops private pension plans. But PBGC insurance has limits. It covers up to a maximum monthly benefit, and the maximum is considerably lower than many workers had expected to receive based on their years of service. Workers who had contributed for 25 or 30 years to a pension that had promised, say, $1,800 per month in retirement might find themselves receiving $800 or less per month from the PBGC. The multi-employer pension plans, which covered workers from multiple companies in the baking industry, were themselves in financial distress and faced their own funding shortfalls. The Teamsters' pension situation was somewhat different and in some ways worse. Hostess had, in the final years before liquidation, been directing pension contributions from worker paychecks, money already withheld from workers' wages, into accounts that were meant to fund pension contributions, but had not actually been forwarding those contributions to the pension funds. An investigation revealed that Hostess had diverted approximately $2 million in worker pension contributions that it had failed to transfer to the relevant pension funds in the period immediately before bankruptcy. This was money taken from workers' paychecks, designated for their retirement, that never arrived. The workers most directly harmed were those who had spent the most years at Hostess, the bakers and drivers who were 10 or 15 years from retirement, who had structured their financial expectations around pension benefits they had been promised, who had in some cases declined better-paying jobs elsewhere because the Hostess pension seemed secure. These workers don't appear much in the coverage of the Twinkie collapse. The coverage was about panic buying and brand nostalgia and the competitive dynamics of the snack cake industry. The workers who built those brands over decades, who made the Twinkies that were being auctioned on eBay for $150, largely disappeared from the narrative. This disappearance is not unique to Hostess. It is, in fact, the standard pattern of deindustrialization. The brand survives, the owners profit, and the workers become a human cost that is acknowledged briefly and then forgotten. What makes the Hostess case somewhat unusual is the scale. 18,500 people is a large number to absorb in a single day, in communities that had often organized significant portions of their local economy around the Hostess plant. In Emporia, Kansas, the closure of the bakery was an economic shock to a small city. In Columbus, Ohio, 600 jobs disappeared. In Indianapolis, in Sacramento. In every city where Hostess had operated, the ripple effects extended beyond the workers themselves, to local suppliers, to service businesses, to the tax bases of communities that had relied on the plant's payroll. The executive compensation issue cannot be separated from the labor conflict. Because it was not merely a moral grievance, it was a genuine strategic mistake. When Hostess's management team, in the middle of its bankruptcy proceedings, awarded significant pay increases to its top executives, it handed the BCTGM a rhetorical weapon that proved impossible to counter. Whatever the financial logic, and management argued that competitive compensation was necessary to retain the executives whose expertise was needed to navigate the bankruptcy. The optics were catastrophic. The specific numbers. In a court filing from August 2012, it emerged that Hostess had paid its CEO, Brian Driscoll, approximately $2.55 million in the 2011 fiscal year, up from $750,000 the previous year. 8 other executives received raises ranging from 35% to 80%. This occurred at the same time that Hostess was before a bankruptcy court, arguing that it could not afford its existing labor agreements and needed workers to accept reduced wages and benefits. Judge Robert Drain, who oversaw the Hostess bankruptcy, was sufficiently concerned about the executive compensation issue that he required Hostess to submit to the court's approval any executive pay packages above a certain threshold during the bankruptcy proceedings. But the damage to management's credibility with the unions was irreversible. The BCTGM negotiators, who were being asked to recommend wage cuts to their members, now had to explain why those cuts were necessary while executives were taking large raises. The answer, that competitive executive compensation and worker wage cuts were two separate strategic decisions driven by different market realities, was technically defensible, but politically untenable. What's instructive about this from a business analysis perspective is the degree to which management appeared to not understand the relationship between its own credibility and its ability to execute the operational restructuring the company needed. Winning a labor negotiation in a bankruptcy proceeding requires a degree of trust. Workers need to believe that their sacrifices will actually result in a viable company, rather than just a more comfortable liquidation for the people at the top. The executive pay decisions systematically destroyed that trust. There is also a deeper management failure that runs throughout the Hostess story, and it precedes the final crisis by years. The company never developed a serious strategic response to the structural transformation of the American food market. Between 2000 and 2012, the American snack food market changed dramatically. Natural and organic food sales were growing at double-digit annual rates. Consumer demand was shifting, at least at the margins, toward products with recognizable ingredients, shorter shelf lives, and cleaner nutritional profiles. The premium end of the food market was expanding. The mass market middle, where Hostess had always operated, was being compressed. During this period, Hostess's product line remained essentially unchanged. The Twinkie in 2012 was the same Twinkie as 1980, made in roughly the same way, sold in roughly the same packaging, at roughly the same price point relative to income. The company was not investing in product development. It was not testing premium extensions. It was not exploring whether the brand equity in Hostess names could be leveraged into different product categories or different market segments. It was managing decline, competently on some days, but managing decline nonetheless. In the final weeks of October and early November 2012, the chain of events that led to liquidation had a quality of inevitability, but only in retrospect. At the time, it was experienced as a series of decisions, each of which might have been made differently. October 3rd, 2012. Hostess files its second Chapter 11 petition. This is not a surprise to anyone watching the company. The financial pressures have been building for months. The company enters bankruptcy with $860 million in debt and $982 million in annual revenue. Numbers that indicate clearly that the business is generating enough revenue to operate, but not enough to service its obligations and invest in its future simultaneously. October through early November. Hostess negotiates with both unions on a new labor agreement. The Teamsters' independent financial advisor reviews the company's books and concludes that the financial distress is genuine, that the alternative to concessions is liquidation. The Teamsters' leadership recommends acceptance. The BCTGM's analysis leads to a different conclusion. November 9th, 2012. BCTGM workers begin striking at 8 of Hostess's 33 bakeries. These 8 plants include some of the company's most important production facilities. The strike immediately begins to affect the company's ability to produce and distribute product. November 12th, 2012. Hostess issues an ultimatum. The company announces that if the striking workers do not return to their jobs by 5 p.m. on November 15th, it will seek permission from the bankruptcy court to liquidate. This is not a bluff. The company genuinely cannot continue to operate with the strike reducing its output while it is simultaneously in bankruptcy with creditors scrutinizing every financial move. November 13th, 2012, Judge Drain orders mediation between Hostess and the BCTGM. The mediation lasts 2 days. It fails. November 15th, 5 p.m. The BCTGM deadline passes without workers returning to their jobs. November 16th, approximately 11 a.m. Judge Drain approves Hostess's motion to begin liquidating. In his ruling from the bench, the judge expresses clear frustration with the outcome. He notes that the workers' concerns about management's competence and trustworthiness were reasonable, but that the financial reality left the court with no basis to deny the liquidation motion. The precise words Judge Drain used in approving the liquidation are worth noting. He acknowledged that the workers had legitimate grievances, that management had made decisions that undermined trust, and that in a more functional negotiating environment, the outcome might have been different. But he also noted that the court cannot compel a bankrupt company to continue operating when it lacks the financial resources to do so. In the 2 hours after the announcement, Hostess's brand social media presence received tens of thousands of messages, mostly expressions of shock and grief from consumers who had grown up eating the products. The workers who had just lost their jobs were not posting on Twitter. They were making phone calls to their union reps, to their mortgage servicers, to their doctors about how long their health insurance would remain active. The gap between those two reactions, the consumer grief over a snack food and the worker grief over a livelihood, captures something essential about the way American culture processes industrial collapse. We mourn the product. We barely see the people who made it. The new Hostess launched its first product sales in July 2013. The Twinkie, the same recipe, the same taste, in packaging that echoed the original closely enough to trigger the nostalgia the new owners were paying $410 million for, hit shelves in Walmart, Target, and convenience stores across the country. The marketing was sophisticated and self-aware. The tagline was "the sweetest comeback in the history of ever." It acknowledged the mythology directly. It leaned into the cultural resonance of the brand's disappearance and return. Consumers responded enthusiastically. Initial sales significantly exceeded projections. The operational model was entirely different. The new Hostess employed a small fraction of the original company's workforce. Rather than company-owned trucks and employed drivers, it used third-party distributors. Rather than 33 owned bakeries, it contracted with co-manufacturers and operated a limited number of company facilities. The 372 collective bargaining agreements were replaced by nothing. The new company's small workforce was non-union. The unit economics of the revived Hostess were dramatically better than the original. Without the legacy pension obligations, without the complex union work rules, without the enormous distribution infrastructure, the same product that had been sold at a marginal loss by the original Hostess could be sold profitably. This is the central, uncomfortable truth of the Hostess story. The brand and the products were viable. The business model built around them was not. The difference between the two was largely the accumulated obligations of decades. Obligations to workers, to pension funds, to a distribution infrastructure built for a different era of American commerce. Whether those obligations were legitimate is not really a question with a clean answer. The workers earned those pension benefits. The union contracts were negotiated in good faith. The distribution infrastructure was built because it was the right model for its time. The obligations were real. But the business could not carry them and also survive. The 4 lessons this story demands to be told. First, legacy cost. Structures can outlast the businesses that created them. The costs that killed Hostess were not the result of bad decisions in the 2000s. They were the accumulated result of decisions made over 50 years, pension plans negotiated in the 1960s, work rules established in the 1970s, distribution infrastructure built in the 1950s. By the time the company recognized that these structures were incompatible with its competitive position, they had calcified into obligations that were legally and practically very difficult to renegotiate. The lesson is not that companies should avoid obligations to their workers. It is that the long-term viability of those obligations needs to be continuously stress-tested against changing market realities, not deferred until the crisis arrives. Second, credibility is not a soft asset. The executive compensation decisions at Hostess in 2011 and 2012 were, from a narrow financial perspective, defensible. The company needed to retain executives who understood the bankruptcy process, and competitive compensation was required to do that. But those decisions destroyed the one thing that a successful bankruptcy reorganization requires: the belief of the workers being asked to sacrifice that their sacrifice will actually matter. Without that belief, labor concessions are impossible to achieve. The company could not afford the executives it was paying for because it could not afford the perception those salaries created. Third, market changes do not wait for companies to be ready. Hostess's position in the American food market was eroding structurally for at least a decade before its final collapse. The shift in consumer preferences toward natural ingredients, premium products, and nutritional transparency was not a sudden development. It was a slow, sustained demographic and cultural shift that was visible in the market data for years. Hostess's response was minimal. The lesson is not that Hostess should have become an organic food company. Brand extensions have limits. And the Twinkie brand does not naturally extend to kale chips. The lesson is that the company needed to be investing in growth areas of the food market where its manufacturing and distribution capabilities could be deployed, rather than betting entirely on the durability of its core products. Fourth, in zero-sum negotiations, both sides can lose everything. The final confrontation between Hostess management and the BCTGM was, by November 2012, a situation in which the available outcomes were bad and worse. There was no version of events in which all 18,500 workers kept their jobs. The question was whether some workers would keep modified jobs in a restructured company, or whether all workers would lose everything. The BCTGM's decision to strike, made rationally, made in response to legitimate grievances, made by workers who had reason not to trust management's promises, ultimately resulted in the worst outcome for everyone, including the union members themselves. The Teamsters, who accepted the deal, lost their jobs too when the liquidation came. In a negotiation over the survival of an enterprise, the threat of complete shutdown has to be evaluated as a genuine possibility, not as a bargaining tactic. By any accounting, the distribution of outcomes from the Hostess collapse was grotesquely unequal. The private equity firms that had acquired Hostess in 2009 for approximately $130 million in equity had their investment largely wiped out. But Ripplewood and its co-investors had, in the years between the acquisition and the liquidation, extracted certain fees and management charges from the company. The total return to the equity investors was deeply negative, but not as negative as the raw equity loss would suggest. The buyers of the brand assets, Apollo Global Management and Metropolis and Conglomerates, invested $410 million in 2013 for the Hostess cake brands and relaunched the company as a profitable, growing business. By 2016, the revived Hostess had revenues of approximately $800 million and had gone public through a SPAC transaction at a valuation in the billions. The investors in the revival made enormous returns. The 18,500 workers who lost their jobs in November 2012 found themselves navigating an economy that was still recovering from the 2008 financial crisis. Unemployment in many of the communities where Hostess had operated was elevated. The jobs that had been lost, unionized manufacturing jobs with defined benefit pensions, were not being created in large numbers in the American economy of 2012. Many workers found new employment, but in many cases at lower wages, without the pension benefits they had expected, and without the job security that a unionized plant had provided. The BCTGM's pension plan faced serious underfunding issues that would persist for years, affecting not just former Hostess workers, but workers across the baking industry who had contributed to the same multi-employer plans. The pension insurance from the PBGC provided some floor, but for workers who had planned for retirement based on higher expected benefits, the shortfall was significant. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, to which many Hostess drivers had contributed as part of their benefits, was already one of the most underfunded large pension plans in the country by 2012. Former Hostess Teamsters were among the hundreds of thousands of workers whose retirement security was threatened by that fund's insolvency. In Emporia, Kansas, the Hostess bakery sat idle for months before being repurposed. The 600 jobs it had provided were not replaced by a single employer. The local economic development authority worked to attract smaller businesses, but the gap was not easily filled. This pattern repeated in communities across the country where Hostess had been a major employer. The popular narrative of the Twinkies' return in 2013, the sweetest comeback in the history of ever, was genuinely felt by consumers who had mourned the product's disappearance. But it was experienced differently by the people who had made the Twinkies. There was no comeback for them. The jobs did not return. The pensions did not restore themselves. The community economic damage did not repair with the return of the yellow packaged cakes to the convenience store shelf. The Hostess Bakery in Emporia, Kansas was eventually repurposed. The building stands. The structure that housed the ovens and the mixing equipment and the conveyor belts, the building where 600 people worked 5 days a week for decades, still exists. The machines are gone, the equipment was auctioned off, industrial ovens, commercial mixers, packaging lines, and shipped to other facilities, other companies, other uses. The specific machinery that made the specific products that 600 specific workers had tended was dispersed, sold for whatever the market would bear, and is now somewhere else entirely. The Twinkie that you can buy today is identical in taste to the one that was made in that building. The recipe survived, the brand survived, the golden sponge cake with the cream filling survived. What did not survive was the set of relationships between the company and its workers, between the workers and their union, between the factory and its community that had organized those 600 lives for 40 years. Those relationships did not transfer with the intellectual property. They could not be auctioned. They were simply ended. Hostess Brands today is a functioning, profitable company. It makes Twinkies and Ding Dongs and Ho-Hos and sells them across America and internationally. Its revenues are growing. Its management team is competent. Its cost structure is sustainable. It employs a few hundred workers, down from 18,500. Somewhere in that gap, 18,500 minus a few hundred, is the actual story of what happened. Not the story of a brand that died and came back. The story of the people who made the brand what it was, who were told that their labor costs were incompatible with survival, who watched the brand they had built be sold for $410 million and relaunched by new owners making new profits, and who were not invited to participate. The lesson that the Twinkie teaches, if you're willing to look at it straight, is not about adapt or die. The brands didn't adapt, they were sold. The adaptation was performed by different people, under different conditions, with a different workforce. The lesson is about what we value and what we choose not to see. The Twinkie outlasted everything. The Depression, the war, the fitness boom, the nutritional science, the bankruptcy, the liquidation. It outlasted the company that made it and came back under new management smiling from the shelf. It outlasted the people who made it, too. That's the thing about the Twinkie. The mythology always was that it would survive anything. It just turned out that anything included the people who made it.